we're going to do Emor. So you're in chapter 21 of the book of Leviticus, if you've got a book there. And so Emor follows Kedoshim, which was all about holiness. And this book, or this chapter, begins with holiness, but it refers to the holiness regarding the high priest and the Kohen Gadol and the regular Kohen. So that's the focus as it begins. And it doesn't stay there, because it'll go through the chapters dealing with the feasts and the festivals, and then it'll end up in the discussion of Egyptian Hebrew and what he owned in the land or didn't own. So that's the direction it goes. But I want to stick to I first want everybody to understand that I'm drawing from the Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, who I found when I was in Israel to be obviously very famous, but he was a questioner. And so to begin with, I'm going to ask a question. What do we know about Emor? What do we know? And it's from that question that I have to ask myself, what do I know? And what don't I know? And so I'm going to deal with what I think I know, but I want you to help me. So we're looking at, in particular, something which is really hidden in the text. It's not stated correctly. It's not stated openly or orally, but is only hinted at. And that's getting into a text that's far lower than where we normally would be. But here we go, as we start into this. I want you to open your Bibles to chapter 21 and verse 16. And we're going to talk about, again, something that seems strange to me, but I'm sure it's not to you. In verse 16, it says, Hashem spoke to Moses saying, now all of this is about God telling Moses, tell somebody. And it says, speak to Aaron saying, any man of your offspring throughout their generations in whom there will be a blemish shall not come near to offer the food of his God. So the Cohen, Aaron is now telling, or Moses is now telling Aaron, God says he doesn't want some people to come near the food who have a blemish. Now, it goes further by telling us, really, it uses the word blemish 5 times. So there's something in this that we need to understand, or that we have to really grasp to understand not only this, but thinking about why people have handicaps, why God created people with physical disabilities. That's going to be the big question that is here. So the question is, what do we know? What do we think we know? What do we want to know? Okay. So in verse 18, he says, for any man in whom there is a blemish shall not approach a man who is blind or lame, or whose nose has no bridge, or who has one limb longer than the other, or in whom there will be a broken leg or a broken arm, or who has abnormally long eyebrows and a membrane on his eye, or a blemish in his eye, or a dry skin eruption, or a moist skin eruption, or has crushed testicles. Any man from among the offspring of Aaron and the Cohen who has a blemish shall not approach to offer the fire offerings of Hashem. He has a blemish. The food of God he shall not approach to. Think about it. Here is our God, omnipotent, beyond words. And yet, we have people in a field where they are supposed to be the spiritual light for the community, but are unable to serve. Do you understand the question? Why would God create such a situation? And that's not even to mention all of the other people who have handicaps and birth defects and all of the other things that go with it. But that's the question that comes from this text. And so that's the thing that I want us to think about, because it's a very, well, I taught school and I was a principal for 43 years. Now, during that time, I was never allowed to tell anybody that I wouldn't accept their child in school, no matter what their disability. And some of them were so severe that they simply had a nurse, and they were having the nurse sit in the class with the child. And we're not sure how much the child actually gleaned from the whole thing. We had those that had just the average birth defects. But in this whole story that I'm trying to get across, I was never allowed to say, no, you can't. You can't come here. But here God has created a person who has a handicap. And this person happens to have a handicap in the field of the priesthood. And so God tells him, you cannot serve. What do we know? Now, we can say that God is making his decision, but was it God who made these men the way they are? So how can he punish them for the decisions that he made? How often is a person with a physical handicap, even today, discriminated against? Is it right? And finally, is there a disability based on something that somebody might have done in a previous life? In other words, are they here to rectify something that happened in a prior? Those are the questions that I had to deal with this week as I'm going through this. So you can see this is a very lighthearted lesson. Not much to it. But it's a question you probably have all asked at one point in time or another when you saw somebody who was disabled. Why do some children have Down syndrome? And in the same family, they're perfectly normal. All those questions have always been in my mind, 43 years worth. Now you can add 5 or 10 more. But they're always in my mind. And so I shouldn't say constantly, but I do a lot of times think about that. And so it intrigued me enough that I decided that I was going to try to tackle that question and come up with some sort of an answer, and ask maybe you might have some suggestions for me as I go through it. But anyway, we're going to try to understand, reach the point of understanding of someone who has dealt a life-changing handicap that we are not to judge, but at the same time, only God knows the reason why these things happen. And then the question becomes, well, actually, I should preface it with what the sages have said. The sages say that this world is a world of lies. A world of lies. Now, how does that fit in to this story? They believe that what may appear to be a punishment or a curse could be a blessing in disguise. And that is how they view it, which is a good philosophy to have. At least I think so. Now, this physical problem is about some sort of a rectification of our soul, as they would look at it. How does this disability help to rectify them? And that's my point. Because you see, I'm about trying to rectify my soul. And I don't bear the handicaps that many kids do or many adults do. What am I talking about? What am I thinking about? Everything has a reason. Nothing has happened to me that first has not passed through the hands of God. I know that. That is a certainty. And we should all understand that. God is in control of all things. That's why they call him omnipotent, omnipresent. He's there for everything. Everything is there in front of him. Now, we may not always be able to explain why, but we are called upon to have faith in God's ultimate decision. That's where faith comes into this story. Now, at some level, the Cohen's disqualification from serving in the temple really deals with a powerful message. And this is what I came up with. The world is not perfect, and these blemishes are about a needed rectification for the world also. Now, not easy to understand, but I come by that by saying, since we know God is perfect and how he challenges, or how can we challenge or change the divinely decreed plans of God? In case you don't realize it, we are about to be confronting a paradox of human free will versus God's omnipotence. God commanded Adam to tend a garden. At my old house in Indiana, I had 13 garden beds that were bigger than my whole yard down here. I had better than a third of an acre planted in garden and flowers and all of the bushes and trees and everything else. And the one thing I was sure of after I did the first week's worth of cleaning up is the fact that gardens are messy. And here's God's message to Adam: tend the garden, clean it up. Now, as you're going through that whole process of thinking about that, was he asking him to keep it perfect? Understand that the idea of gardens is really a metaphor in this story. Really, it's about God commanding us to rectify the world because there are many imperfections in it. That's what we're here for. Each and every one of us has a part to play in the rectification of this world. Our part may not be very big. We're not a president of the United States. We don't serve in Congress, but we all have a part in this rectification. Now, we read these 5 verses, and during that whole time, you saw the word blemish 5 times. Now, again, God does not waste words. And if he uses a word 5 times in 5 sentences, there must be something to that word and something that we need to understand or glean from that word. Now, the word for blemish in Hebrew is the word mum. Mem, yud, mem sofit. Mem has a value of 40. Vav has a value of 6. And the final mem is 40. Total of 86. Okay, so we now have a value of 86, and we can compare it to other words in the scriptures that have the same value, because that is what a Jew will do. And so the 2 words that came to mind right away, soon as I saw the number 86, was Elohim and Hateva, nature. So a blemish is like God and a blemish is like nature. What does that mean? Well, let me add to that. You see, the 5 that it's talking about is sometimes compared to the 5 levels of the soul. Remember, the first level is nephesh, ruach, neshama, haya, and yakidah. And you see, we spend our lives climbing the ladder of our soul to get back to God. because you see, we're in a world that is far different than the one we came from. Now, remember, in the world that we came from, we were with God. And if you were with God where he was in his world, it's perfect. But then God sent us down here. It's a suicide mission because things are going to be different once you get here. How different? Well, when you're with God, everything is one because God is one. And as you move down the 5 worlds to reach the one that we're in now, we go down 5 worlds, and each world begins to separate, and things begin to coalesce around other things. And eventually what happens is the fact that we're in a world where there are all kinds of things around us. Some of them are there to help us. In fact, they're all supposed to help us. But many of those things are there that are distractions to what we're to be about, because we're here to rectify something. We're here to rectify the world. Now, you don't consider yourself one of those big characters that's what you're going to do with your life. But let me tell you, that's what you are to do with your life. Then you have to ask yourself, well, what is my purpose? What am I rectifying? What am I working on? And that's something that we'll talk about as we go along. Now, understand then, Elohim, my favorite chapter in the Bible, Genesis 1. I go there almost every week. In Genesis 1, it begins by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The God that we see there is called Elohim. Elohim's name is written 26 times in that first chapter. 26. That's another number I can compare to. You see, that's the number of God's name for mercy. You see, our God is a merciful God. He sent you on a mission, and if you miss the target, he doesn't banish you to another world. But in this process, God is merciful. But you see, we're in a world that covers him over. Because in the beginning, God created this world with his name, Elohim. And on each and every day, God built a layer to cover over who he was so that we would have free choice. You see, if we could really see God, there would be no choice. You would obey simply because. When you have a police car following you down the road and you're doing the speed limit, you know you're not going to speed because there's a police car behind you. You've already established you understand right from wrong. Now look at it from this point of view. So we have this period of descending into this world. And our attempt is to ascend from this world. In other words, moving up the levels of our soul till we reach again to be with God. Now, there was one man who almost made it, Moshe. He was the closest that we've ever come to having somebody reach that 50th level, that highest point. He was the only one who came close to that. Now, in our story then, nature then also is a cover, and it keeps us from seeing what it is our function is to be. I had a friend, name was Bert, and Bert had a heart problem. The vessels in his heart only filled blood into the top half of his heart. The bottom half of his heart had no blood to it. The blood passed through it, but there was no way to feed that bottom half of his heart. And so he went to Indianapolis to get a heart transplant. Well, in the midst of the transplant, it went wrong and he ended up dying. But I go down and visit him. And when I went down to visit him, I think was the last time, I was sat down with Bert and we were talking, and he said to me, you know, I know exactly why I was here. And I said, you know exactly? He said, yeah. He said, there's a little Jewish girl that's my nurse. And she came into this room and she looked at me and we got to striking up a conversation, and she walked out of the room and then she came back again. She says, that's a very interesting ring that you're wearing. He said, yeah, I got it when I was in Israel. And he says, she asked him, well, do you know what it means? Yeah. And she said, well, it's the name of God. But I don't practice God. I don't practice anything. You see, my family never did. But you're Jewish. Well, I know, that's just by name. Well, she came back a couple more times, I guess, to him and sat with him and talked with him. And finally she left the room the last time he remembers. And she said, you know, I'm going to go home and ask my mom. I need to understand what it was and what it is I'm supposed to be about. That was the last conversation I had with Bert, and that was the last conversation that I think Bert needed. Understood what his purpose was. That is an interesting problem. You see, we're commanded to bring healing and rectification and redemption wherever we go, whenever it's possible, right? Whenever it's possible, because you see, you have to have a willing subject to even talk with about some of these things. And there's so many times when we don't have that person or whatever have you. But again, we must understand everything first passed through the hands of God. Now, there's a story about 7 beggars. Rabbi Nachman, who was the grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. I like dropping names because I think they're cool. But anyway, Rabbi Nachman was a very powerful and influential rabbi. And he, besides dealing with different people, he also told a lot of stories. And one of the stories he told was called the story of the 7 beggars. Now, the story of the 7 beggars starts out in a very small village that was overrun by an evil king, and everybody was forced to flee from the city. And in fleeing from the city, the 2 little kids, 5 years old, were separated from everybody else, and they found themselves in the middle of the woods with no food, no water. Now, they were scrambling and panicking, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. And all of a sudden, a man came up and sat with them. And he calmed them. He gave them bread, and he gave them water. But he said, I need to leave now, but I'll see you again. Well, the little ones wanted to go with him because obviously he knew where he was going, until they figured out that he was blind. So he left, and the next one came, because you see there's 7 beggars, so there's got to be seven parts to the story. So the second one came by. Again, they had been out of food and they're out of water and they didn't know what to do. And the second beggar came up and he sat down with them and he gave them bread and he gave them water and he talked at them. And they asked him questions, but he kept talking, and they kept asking more questions and he kept talking. And finally he says, you probably are trying to talk to me, but understand that I'm deaf and I can't hear you. But I'm going to leave now, but don't worry, I'll see you again. Well, the little ones were worried, but they stayed there. Well, along comes a third beggar. And he comes by, and again, they're out of bread, they're out of water, and he began to talk to them. You see, he stuttered, and his stuttering was so bad that they couldn't understand a word that he said. But they knew he was kind because he gave them bread and he gave them water. And before he left, as the others had done, he said, I'll see you again. Well, the story continues. And as it continues, it goes beyond the stuttering. It goes to one who had a crippled throat. In other words, it was raspy and it couldn't be understood. And then there was a man who came by who was a hunchback. And then along came another beggar that had no hands. And finally along came another beggar who had no feet. Each and every one of them was kind to the 2, but each and every one of them left, but said, don't worry, I'll see you again. And so the little ones finally found their way out of the woods and into a village where they were taken in, and they shared a home. And finally, the people in the village says, you people, you two ought to get married. You've been together for so long. Well, why don't you just get married? And so they had a wedding. Well, guess what? At the wedding, they all came back. Each and every one of them came back to wish them well. But each and every one of them came back to tell them, do you realize what happened when I saw you? You see, each one was affecting those two little ones, not in the way that would lead them out of the woods, but they were affected by what they offered them. Oh, sure, they offered them bread and water, but no, they offered them confidence. They offered them the feeling of presence. Now, in the story, we're talking about people that have physical and mental handicaps, blemishes, as the book calls it, things that would keep them from serving God the way we would have thought they should have. Now, in our story, the one thing we had to understand from the 7 beggars was, it's all about your attitude. Each of us has a handicap. Some of us is a mental handicap. Some of us it's a physical handicap. Some of us it's a spiritual handicap. But then the question comes, what kind of an attitude do you have? Some of the happiest kids I had to deal with at school were Down syndrome kids. I don't know how many of them you've ever dealt with, but those little goofballs have smiles on their faces all the time, even when they're doing something naughty. They just are happy. Don't know why they're happy, but they're just as happy as can be. And then when you see their parents, you understand why, because their parents are happy. Now, why are you happy to have a child who's not going to be capable of becoming a doctor, a mechanic, whatever have you? But they were. Jacob had a problem. Jacob ended up with a physical handicap. You remember that? He was wrestling with the angel of Esau. Now, in wrestling with the angel of Esau, I remember it was about daylight, and the angel says, I got to get back to God. And he says, no. And so the angel reaches out and touches his side, creating a limp that he would have for the rest of his life. But he says, you've got to bless me. And how did he bless him? He told him that he would soon have a new name. The name would be Israel. And then the question came to me, well, why does he call him Israel? Because it says he strove with God and man and prevailed. Attitude. Another story. I love stories, so here's another one. 2 rabbis were traveling down the road, and the people there didn't like them. So they had them thrown in jail. So they found themselves in jail. And in this jail cell that they were in, there were other assorted convicts. And besides those convicts that they had, there was a bucket in the middle of the room. That was the toilet for that particular cell. Well, about an hour after being there, one of the rabbis began to cry. It wasn't so much that he was hurting. His brother asked him, he says, well, why are you crying? And he says, because I can't pray and I can't talk about the Torah. Because you can't say those things and talk about those things when you're in a bathroom. And there was the bucket in the middle of the room, so they couldn't. Well, that's what they couldn't do. Then the question was, what could they do? And so the one that was crying got up and began to sing and to dance. So they were singing and dancing all around the bucket, creating so much noise that the jail guards came down. They opened up the door, looked in the room. Everybody was sitting down except the two that they brought in. They said, "What's going on?" He says, "I don't know, but it's about that bucket there in the center of the room." As soon as they talked about it, all of a sudden they got up and started singing and dancing. And finally he says, "Well, I'll put an end to that." So he picked up the bucket and took it out of the room. They both sat down and immediately started to pray and study Torah. Again, the idea is, or what I consider to be the final answer is, the story points to our problems, not only with Cohen, but with ourselves, things that disqualify us from doing other things. And although there's a handicap that seems to make it to be very unfair, the underlying message is that God knows and God understands, and that each one of us can reach his potential, rectifying by not doing, well, something that would have been normally a part of their service. You see, there's always something we can do. You know, the Gentiles came after the Jews got the Torah and said, "Well, how come you didn't offer it to us?" This is a midrashic writing. "Well, why didn't you offer it to us?" And he says, "Well, I tell you what, I'll give you a commandment. If you can follow the commandment, then I will give you the Torah too." They said, "Well, fine." He says, "I want you to go build a sukkah and I want you to live in it for a week." Well, that was easy enough. Well, they went and built their sukkahs and they started to be in their sukkahs, and God brought hot weather over 100 degrees, no clouds. You can imagine what they would have been like after 2 or 3 days in that sukkah. They kicked the gates as they walked out of the sukkah and they left. They ran into a rabbi and he says, "I don't know how you can put up with this Torah." "Well, what do you mean?" He says, "Well, all we wanted to do was to live in a sukkah for a week, and we couldn't do it because it was so hot." He says, "Well, don't you know the rules?" "What rules?" "Well, if the weather is inclement, too hot or too cold, you don't have to live in it. Visit it. And if it smells, don't occupy it. And if it's full of insects, you don't have to occupy it either." You see, there's sometimes when we just don't understand the rules of the game. And sometimes it's because of our attitude, the way we look at things and the way we act. You see, it was really about the Cohen's attitude towards his situation that determined whether he, to the extent to which he found it to be helpful or a hindrance. Could the Cohen have done other things to rectify himself? The answer is probably, more than likely. Otherwise, God wouldn't have put it upon him. So for some, handicaps are because of a rectification that they needed to do from a previous life. Sometimes it's because they want us to develop an attitude, an acceptance of where we are and what we can do with what we have.